No Mordes and la Coalición de Derechos Humanos present part 2 of a 3-part report series called The Disappeared: How the U.S. Border Enforcement Agencies are Fueling a Missing Persons Crisis. Water gallons placed in the southwest border regions are essential to the preservation of life of those crossing the border. In Part 2, we investigate the U.S. Border Patrol's vandalization of water bottles intended for these people. Over the last 2 decades, the remains of at least 7,000 people have been recovered from the United States borderlands. The majority of these deaths are caused by exposure to the elements, including extreme heat and cold, as well as dehydration from lack of access to water. The number of recovered remains is only one part of this tragedy. An unknown number of people have disappeared. Their bodies may never be found, recovered, or identified. Prevention through deterrence is the name of the policy that is designed to create a fatal consequence for those who try to cross the border. It forces those fleeing violence or poverty to cross in the most rugged and remote terrain. It is the policy responsible for the crisis of death and disappearance in the borderlands. This policy relies on the daily action of on-the-ground agents, such as the routine destruction of humanitarian aid supplies placed throughout desolate areas. To better understand this vandalization, we studied data collected by No Mordes volunteers for 3 years, during which volunteers placed 31,558 gallons of water in remote crossing corridors. 86% of this water was used, showing the high need for these supplies. During the 3 years, gallons were vandalized 415 times, or at least twice a week. We compared vandalism rates across seasons, hunting versus non-hunting, and land jurisdictions to determine who was responsible. We found that although the likelihood of vandalism increased during hunting season, there remained a relatively high vandalism rate during non-hunting season, showing that hunters are not responsible for the majority of the destruction. An analysis of land jurisdictions showed that there was no significant difference in vandalism between private, federal forest land, and state trust land. Because Border Patrol agents are the only actors with equal access to these lands, we conclude that they are the most likely actor responsible. We assert that Border Patrol agents using their paid time to commit these acts with no known consequence endorses the action and encourages other actors. In addition to vandalism, Border Patrol agents interfere with humanitarian aid by harassing humanitarian aid workers. They surveil, detain, interrogate, and threaten arrest and physical violence. Agents have also routinely surrounded the No Mordes medical aid camp, creating an atmosphere of intimidation in a space where injured, ill, and traumatized people come seeking aid and respite. This deters people crossing from accessing life-preserving aid. We conclude that these deadly practices cannot be dismissed as the misguided behavior of a few rogue agents. Rather, the culture of the U.S. Border Patrol both authorizes and normalizes such acts of cruelty. Consequently, we recommend that U.S. Border Patrol designate the destruction of humanitarian aid supplies and the obstruction of aid efforts a fireable offense. We call for the establishment of policy guidelines prohibiting this destruction. We call upon the United Nations and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to open inquiries into these practices. And finally, because we recognize that humanitarian aid ameliorates but does not solve the crisis caused by militarized borders, we call on Customs and Border Protection to permanently dismantle the U.S. Border Patrol and to establish a reparations program for the families of all persons disappeared or deceased as a result of the U.S. border policy of prevention through deterrence.